I'm going to scuttle through this because it's like Dragon's Den. I've got 10 minutes to sell you space to park and a survey program that will connect with the people who buy new homes in your area. We will mainly be in the developments that are away from town centres, but in Kent certainly, and on the Isle of Wight certainly, these are the majority of places that are being built. And so we are really looking at the old kind of suburbs. Space to park. Please do access it if you can, because it's a brilliant piece of work. It came out in 2014, had a parliamentary launch, a lot of research behind it, and it's well worth looking up, both the online version and, if you're lucky enough, the hard copy version. I'd also ask you to consider looking at a survey program. This one you may or may not identify with, but it's available from me to give you an idea of how local authorities, developers, urban designers can connect with the people who actually buy the houses, the people making their biggest single purchase of their lives often, and what they feel about the things that we've been offering them over the past 20 years or so. Now, here's an example of a development that was probably built late 90s, early 2000s. And another. And another. Excuse, that's me shooting out of a windscreen. Sometimes you have to be ready to cut and run just in case anybody takes exception. Guess the car. Suffice to say that is parked on, or was parked on, the pavement day in, day out, without any apparent use other than maybe at the weekends, blocking the footway to vulnerable road users or street users, and it's a Ferrari. Here again, in the same development, which was a flagship development where quality of design was being put forward, various developments won awards, but they won awards based on professional opinion and not the opinion of those who lived there, because the results of the surveys that I mentioned actually suggested that people weren't too happy with certain aspects. This is the traffic light system for those surveys, which relate to the area where the two developments that I've just shown you are. Red means bad. And the more richer green means very good. And as you can see, you put those together there, and only 3 of the areas, and they happen to be the older areas, are actually showing anything other than a negative view of car parking. Safety is better, and yet clearly there is an appreciation of the attractiveness and friendliness. You may wonder what V4K means. Safety, attractiveness and friendliness were the measures that Kent County Council were using for new homes and what people deserve to have living in their new homes. And we put in parking so that we could get a realistic idea of what people felt. And here again, the same developments, looking at both the parking rating, what did people think of it? Red means negative, very negative, and whether there were parking problems, which in a way you could say always go hand in hand. There's another indicator there, which is the garages used for parking, of which quite a lot of them weren't, largely because some of them you couldn't even get a car in. Here's another failure of design. This street should have been quite nice to live in, according to those who built it. And people are fairly satisfied with the locality, but you will see there's a maintenance nightmare in the making because people are parking on the street, manoeuvring on it, instead of actually using parking round the back. There weren't too many, it wasn't an under provision of parking there, it was merely where it was and people's preferences for parking away from it. Motorists are very cunning, they'll get a car in anywhere given the chance. And sometimes it's not actually going to do any harm. But you give them a cycle route and they move in. This street wasn't quite complete, and there's a major problem because the cycle route is already being used for parking. People preferred that to the parking provision that they had actually been offered there, which were behind those gates and possibly also in parking courts. And here again, another cycle route, nice, just the right width for a car to park on. And dealing with that after people have moved in isn't easy. So are those quality streets? Are we proud of them? Let's get away from the idea that everything is urban, controllable. These are streets in areas where you wouldn't want to be putting weighting restrictions on. Even the ones that were on the high-end development, there was a suggestion of doing that, but would councillors go through with it if the people objected, even though they're the ones who park on the pavements? Of course, you can always bury car parking and hide it. Just pretend it doesn't exist. You can try and constrain it, which isn't the aim of the current government, as I understand it. It's actually about getting the developments in the right place where maybe you can control parking. Of course, neither do we want to be putting cars on a pedestal, and that's the problem, that we've wanted to hide cars instead of actually designing them into the developments properly as an integral part, because often it's the second most expensive purchase. You can, of course, either retrofit or upfront fit with bollards, if that's what you want to do. I wish I had shares in a bollard company. And in case you think that this is a bit funny, these bollards are deliberately at an angle. They were designed by Wayne Hemingway for a development in Dartford, but that's another story. Basically, when it comes to a realistic approach to how you deal with car parking and the amounts, it's ideological to suggest that if you reduce the amount of parking where you will not have any controls on parking, that you will reduce car ownership. What you can do by siting developments properly is actually discourage car use, reducing the need to travel. And of course, with more electric cars, that will be something where people may decide they're going to use their cars less, but that doesn't mean they're not going to want to own them. And so we don't want to put ideology in the place of practical reality. So the golden rule for design would be the right number of the right spaces in the right places, with related agendas of crime and the fear of crime, safety, health, inclusive access and maintenance. Most of those are covered in the surveys that were done. And there's that Ferrari again. Now, of course, there are solutions. Here's an urban one from Germany, I believe. I think it's real. But as I say, we're looking at places where you wouldn't want to be putting double yellow lines. You wouldn't want draconian measures. You want people to have the cars that they believe that they need, but you want to be providing also the alternatives to travel. I don't believe the government is having a war on the car industry at the moment. Now, these are the least land using spaces when they are parallel with the carriageway. This is actually a spine road that carries buses through a major new development, but there is plenty of place for visitors, the odd resident, and cars can still move in between and the buses running through. This is another one where the cars just off the carriageway edge. There's curtilage parking to the rear, courtyard parking to the right. Another example where angled bays are used. This is slightly more land hungry, but actually you can create an attractive street scene. I'd say all of these parking solutions are ones which are appreciated either neutrally or very positively by the people that we surveyed, as opposed to the ones that people disliked intensely and found to be problematic. And again, waiting for the landscaping to mature, but clean lines, space for parking that has been deliberately designed into the development. Here again, making use of a feature, not completed there, the turfs hadn't been laid, but using a feature that existed on the site and actually grouping parking around it in a way that satisfied the residents very well. and there they have their own private spaces within their houses, but also on-street parking that comes around that mound. And there's a wider view showing that this was a development where there were different approaches in different places, and we'll go through those quickly, those approaches. So, for example, here you've got adjacent parking, waiting again for the landscaping to perk up and give a much greener approach to things. This is in Swanley, so it's quite close to a railway station, and people were appreciative of that particular layout. Same development from a different angle. This development was a social housing development in a rural area, and was one of the highest satisfaction developments from the residents in all respects of the development. And it was also a place where children were playing quite happily on the green, and even to a certain degree in the street. Just going through a development where action had to be taken on parking. This was an old paper mill, not too far from London. A river was opened up through it. It previously went actually underneath the mill and powered it. And squares and other forms of providing the parking were put in. But in this particular case, we knew that if there weren't waiting restrictions, it would have to be, well, it would become a mess. And so actually the developer in that case kept control of the streets. Always an option, provided it doesn't then force parking out onto neighbouring streets, and have put in management there. And again, that is appreciated by the residents. Then you can use squares, again, waiting for the trees, where this was in winter, but using a square format. People were very happy here. They've got curtilage parking, on-street parking for visitors, and a sense of place that was much appreciated. This is a much more dense development near Canterbury, but again, the square format was used with the rights of way, the street itself running through quite constrained. I'm afraid no wonky bollards there. Those were the bollards themselves were a preventative measure, but the curbs were of such that I don't think we've ever seen anybody parking on the footways there at all. And good old Poundbury, there's still things to learn from Poundbury. I know people boo and hiss sometimes when they see it, but actually there's a lot to learn from the different phases. And again, this was a square with the route running through it. Then moving off the carriageway into courtyard parking. This is frontage courtyard in a very landscape heavy development. And to be honest, as you drive along that street, you can barely see the cars that are in there. And another development where the courtyard parking was to the front of the dwellings, but very discreet. Unfortunately, this is a weekday when I assume that those who did own cars were out, but there the cars would be largely hidden when the vegetation was in full flow. When you start to do courtyards, rear courtyards, you're talking about 3 or 4 times as much land take. And only if the people are going to use them is that worth the effort of that land take, I feel, because if they're not, you end up with the difficulties on street that you've already seen. The car barns here actually are quite effective with little storage space, but look at the land area that is put over to manoeuvring of cars off the carriageway, probably about 4 times as much, if not more, as would be the case if it was done in curtilage or on street. Again, car barns with utility areas, very neatly done. And courtyard parking in an old isolation hospital workhouse development, again, much appreciated by people. And you can see how the original building lent itself to that particular approach, but also the new build around it, which adopted that principle too. This is where I used to live, and it's interesting that I used to play cricket and football in that street. It was probably about a 7.3 metre road, although actually I guess it was in Imperial when it was built in the 40s or 50s. And it's interesting how 2 lines of parking are along each side and there's a trackway through the middle. I'm not going to say that that's particularly good to look at, but it actually works reasonably well, and contemporary approaches like that with street trees, because don't believe that highway engineers oppose them, they can be persuaded, and I think that's part of the problem. I'm ending up with curtilage parking because it's not particularly popular, but actually the people who own that house have 3 cars, and it's difficult to see how they actually get them onto their site. But that's actually the way in, and with the use of vegetation, trees, everything remains quite discreet. Actually, it looks like the hedges need a bit of a trim there. These are just some sketches that indicate basic curtilage parking or on-street parking, or a balance of both, showing they don't have to be land hungry. Garages are not a reliable form of parking unless you have waiting restrictions and they are the right size, but they can be incorporated into a design. They often end up as storage, bike store, motorbike store. So that's one option with a conventional street. Those figures aren't set in stone, I should add. Neither would the design be as quite as rigid. But if you're going to adopt a shared space approach, then it can be done even more modestly with an approach like that. And so we're going from the fact that we've so often had the negative views of residents saying how poor their developments are for parking and how this impacts upon safety, especially as regards their children wanting to play in the street. And yet where the parking is delivered in the right way, you find that children can play in the street, and those are places where people meet, they socialise, and there's opportunities there for everybody to work together to actually get parking as part of the design. So coming back to the thing, if we want quality streets, we can design parking into those streets if we're willing to actually take an approach that doesn't ideologically push them out, because unless there's going to be control mechanisms or they're in the right place, which many developments still aren't, then cars are here to stay, and we need to actually accommodate them in a positive way that contributes to the design.